Good evening, everyone. My name's Phil Bourne. I'm the Dean of the School of Data Science here. And I know what you're all thinking, oh no, he's not going to give a long... I only have really one thing to say. But I'll preface it by saying that when I was in graduate school, which was in Australia, the mathematics, physical sciences, and biological sciences were one complete side of the campus. There was a big lake in between, and then the humanities, social sciences, and so on, and the art department were on completely the other side of the campus, and we never saw each other. We are not having that here. We have an artist in residence, and I'm not going to do the introductions. I'm just going to say that we are committed in this school to create a bond and a value, which you'll see very much this evening, between arts and sciences. So with that, I'll hand it over to Alex Gates, who, among other people, has done most of the work.
Thank you so much, Phil. So good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Alex Gates. I'm an assistant professor here in the School of Data Science and also co-chair, along with the wonderfully creative Emma Candelier, of the Arts and Artifacts Committee here in the School of Data Science. So tonight is about something at the heart of our work of data scientists, seeing data not just as information, but as inspiration. We believe data is both a tool for discovery and a medium for communication, imagination, and human connection. Our Data and Artist Residence program celebrates this belief by pairing the analytical insights of data with the expressive power of art and design. Data science at its core is an art of storytelling. Every data set reflects choices about what we measure and why. Every analysis shapes a narrative about how we understand the world. Visual storytelling makes these narratives accessible. They invite wider audiences to see the patterns, question our assumptions, and engage with whatever insight we might hope is under there. Through the Data and Artist Residency series, we aim to explore how artists and scientists use visualization, sound, and design to turn complexity into meaning. These conversations remind us that artistry isn't separate from data science, it's embedded within it. This ethos, treating data as both an analytical and artistic pursuit, thrives here because of the remarkable faculty, staff, and students that we have within our walls. Their curiosity, collaboration, and creativity makes evenings like this possible. But in particular, I'd like to acknowledge a few of the most wonderful, energetic people around, specifically Caroline Brown, Emma Cox, Alyssa Brown, Elodie Wolf, and Arlen Burgess for helping us bring this series to life. I'd also especially like to thank our founding dean, Phil Bourne, for championing this residency and for his belief that data science thrives when it connects with design, ethics, and imagination. And of course, I really want to thank all of you for making it out here tonight and joining us to explore how data can inspire not just understanding, but wonder. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our inaugural data artist in residence, Nathalie Miebach. Nathalie's work lives at the boundary between science and art, where numbers take on shape, rhythm, and emotion. She collects data from storms, tides, and atmospheric shifts, translating these measurements into intricate woven sculptures. Using the language of basketry, she gives structure to chaos, transforming raw meteorological information into something tactile, alive, and in many ways deeply human. Through these pieces, she invites us to experience data in ways that our charts and our models could never even begin, through texture, color, and movement. Her practice also extends into sound, turning these same data sets into musical compositions that reveal the pulse of the weather itself. And we're going to be treated to one of these performances of a musical piece at the end of the lecture here tonight. So Nathalie's work has been exhibited very widely, including the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Peabody Essex Museum. She's also received fellowships from the TED Global Conference and the Council for Arts at MIT. Her sculptures can be seen in many major public and private collections. So Nathalie reminds us that data science and art share the same impulse to make sense of the world and to share that sense with others. So everyone, please join me in welcoming our inaugural data artist, Nathalie Miebach.
Thank you very much for coming here today. You had other choices tonight, but you decided to come here. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come. And just to give you a kind of time frame, I'm going to be talking for half an hour, and then the real highlight comes. So you know that it's going to only be 30 minutes of me talking, but then we have the concert in the end. So think of me as the opening band, and then we'll have the real highlight coming. So I also want to just take a moment and thank some people. I want to thank, of course, Phil Bourne for supporting this and for having the vision to invite artists into the space. Alex Gates, Emma Candelier, Carolyn Brown, Elodie Wolf, Emma Cox, Allison Karen, Margot Jacks, Arlen Burgess, sorry if I'm mispronouncing these names, and of course all of you who invited me into your offices and into your classrooms. So, and I think it's an example of how these kind of artistic exhibitions or residencies don't happen with one person. There's always a big team behind it. So I wouldn't be here without these people. So thank you so much for their work. So I've been here for 4 or 5 days now. And one thing I've always loved about data is that I think of data and data science as a kind of crossroad where people enter the space from different disciplines, different languages, different purposes, and we all sort of meet together. And even though we may have different ideas about how we want to use the data and for whom we want to work data and who the end audience will be, we all have this shared curiosity about this basic material called data. And this is what I love about spaces like this, that even though in the 3 or 4 days that I've been here, I've heard so many things and I've maybe understood 20% of a lot of what I've been learning about, I still feel a camaraderie to people who work with data. And that's a really wonderful thing to have. I want to talk to you a little bit about how I work with data and why I work with data. And it really begins with this admission, which is I became a sculptor because of my love of data, and particularly because of my love of science. And sculpture was my way of exploring science. And I started this about 25 years ago, and it always begins the same way as it did 25 years ago, which means I'm taking data from an environment either by building my own data collecting devices, like you see here on the left, or going to the internet. And then I take all that data and I translate it into musical scores and or into woven sculptures and installations. And at the beginning, this was very much about using art to explore science. So I would definitely say that there was a didactic purpose to the work. There was almost like 3D graphics. But now, 25 years later, it's much more complicated. The sculptures are helping me to explore and try to understand a little bit deeper the kind of complicated responses that humans have to the data that I'm looking at. This is a Lego art from the 1980s. Oh, we have double vision. So if you want to look at both at the same time, you can pivot your head back and forth. This is a Lego art from the 1980s. And in many ways, it's the most serious slide of this entire presentation and the most important because I learned how to think when I was a kid. And I had a lot of Legos at home. And Legos, and I still have a lot of Legos. So if you come to my apartment, it's filled. I don't have kids, so I don't have to share with anyone. So they're everywhere. But the reason I say I learned to think with Legos is that Legos wasn't just about building things. It was also about understanding systems. So just like many kids, I had this Lego city, and then I had these little people, and I put little stickers on the back, and I put their name on the back, and what kind of car they drove, because they all came with a little car, and what kind of house they lived in, how many kids they had. And then my sister would come for whatever reason, decided to destroy the entire city, and then I'd have to rebuild it. But it wasn't just rebuilding the structures, it was rebuilding these social relationships that I was inventing. And so I think from the very get-go, this idea of using my hands to think something, especially to think through systems, or what I call a system, was sort of inherent in the way that I approached a lot of learning problems. What I work with, though, is data, and the more numerical, the easier it is to work with. I'm okay with maps, but they're already a layer of interpretation, so I'm actually much happier when they're just numbers. And to me, these are building blocks. These are the beginning of everything that I work with, and these are the beginning points of sculptures. When I go into my studio, I walk into this contradiction that I love, and that is, on one hand, as a crafts artist who is trying to understand basket weaving, I know that to really understand this medium, in this case reed, I have to fail with it 1,000 times. I have to break it, twist it, burn it, sit on it. And this kind of language is a little bit more problematic to use with data. So if I say I'm going to twist, burn, sit, cut it up, then is it still data, or has it now become something else? And I'm really, really intrigued by these two messages, because it's much harder for me to fail with data as it is to fail with reed and with basket weaving. And yet I feel an inherent need to find ways to fail with data. And I'm not even sure if failing is the right word, and I'm not even sure if I'm very ambivalent about this word, but I know that I have to try to figure out ways of approaching data in different ways that push it out of the realm that we are so often in the visual ways and in the conceptual ways in which we are so often confronted with in traditional parameters. So the work that I do is focused a lot on extreme weather events. So I like to focus on hurricanes and floods and forest fires. And that sort of fell into weather by chance. It was something that was very easily measurable and all around and available. But I started focusing on extreme weather events because they are very complicated stories. And partly because you have this huge weather event, such as a hurricane. It's this meteorological awesome system in a way that comes and creates all this destruction in a community. And then work is really about watching that community rebuild, and how long it takes for the rebuilding efforts, how very specific and unique they are with each community, and how the rebuilding isn't just about reclaiming spaces like this beach that was completely wrecked, but also the physical rebuilding of houses, and also the economic rebuilding, and also what happens to communities after a storm, because many people cannot rebuild. It's very expensive to rebuild, and so there's oftentimes a socioeconomic reshuffling of who actually gets to come back and rebuild. This is a year after Hurricane Nicole, and I put this one up because the piece that upstairs, that big wall piece, is about Hurricane Nicole and is about what I've observed in this particular community called Daytona Beach. My parents have a little condo there, and their condo itself wasn't destroyed, but the neighborhood around them was very much damaged. And so I got to watch this community rebuild months later, years later, and watch how slow that process was. So what I have to wrestle with in my work is, how do I work with numerical data coming from the storm, with those recovery stories, with these observations that I made on the beach, watching this house slowly deteriorate as it was sort of revealing its inside, watching people reclaim the beach, and wanting to make their own, the sort of normalcy that came actually fairly quickly, and almost an absurd and deterministic way of saying, we're going to rebuild stronger. And it's the reason why I think this piece is so colorful and so optimistic looking, because it was not what I expected to find in the rebuilding of it all. So this is about Hurricane Ian and Nicole, because like many storms, the damage that happens to a community is not always just one storm. It oftentimes is a series of storms. In this case, it was Hurricane Ian 2 months prior to Hurricane Nicole that caused a lot of damage on the beach due to precipitation. It was always over 20 inches of rain. And then 2 months later, Nicole comes. It's a much weaker storm, but because the environment had already been so weakened, it didn't take much but a perpendicular storm surge to knock down all the remaining sea walls that were that were protecting the properties on the beach. And so this sculpture is taking those data from both storms and translating them into these rectangles in the middle. And then the sculptural components around these two rectangles are trying to talk about the aftermath and the kind of optimism, but also the absurdity that I kept seeing by wanting to rebuild exactly what was there before, knowing that there is a good likelihood that this will happen again. So in the main part of this piece are these two rectangles, and they're the size of beach towels. And they take data from each of these and translate them into these very graphic ways. And they are translated in a way that a musician can interpret them. So I think of them as scores. Hurricane Ian is on the left because that was the first storm that came, and then Hurricane Nicole is on the other side. So you have, I can move, right? Yes. Woo. Okay. There's like a wave height, there's wind readings, temperature readings. There is wind reading, temperature. There is historical hurricanes that have been retired. So these domino pieces are actually retired hurricane names. And then you have the storm surge in there as well. So there's a lot of information regarding the storm itself. During the workshop, one of the students was like, "Well, where's the data? I don't understand how you're putting this. Where are these graphics coming from?" So I thought I'd share you this. I start with the numbers, and then I oftentimes create a kind of very crude musical matrix. So this is taking the data from Hurricane Nicole, and all I'm translating here is wave height and wind temperature and cloud cover. So if you look over here, there's this column with black and white rectangles, and this is a piano keyboard. So I'm simply taking the data and plopping them onto a piano keyboard. This down here is cloud cover. This is a timeline, so you can see these are intervals of 2 hours, and I'm simply plotting how high the wave height is and how strong the wind was. Because what I'm also doing is I'm giving this piano keyboard a range. So you can see the 2 feet, 12 feet refers to wave height, and then these numbers refer to wind strength. So it's really kind of simple and kind of basic, but it helps me create these relationships between the data points so I can plot them down in a more graphic way. I also create a lot of other scores. This is another score that's here, and this is Hurricane Ian and Nicole looking at the data in a different way. So one of the things that I kept thinking about is that Hurricane Ian and Nicole are these chess players that are playing with this, with the future or maybe the presence of this town called Daytona Beach, because both of these storms crossed over that town. And so the data in this case, and again, here is the piano keyboard. These are the pitches that the data is basically anchoring on this piano keyboard. But you'll notice that some of them are upright, some of them are upside down. So down here is Ian and Nicole is on the top. And so I was envisioning them sort of playing chess with each other or playing with each other. And then this painting on the background is actually the path of the storm. So one of them is Hurricane Ian that went up the west coast of Florida and then went over to the east. And then you have Hurricane Nicole that's coming from the east and jutting across. So it's not just all fun drawings. There's a reason why I'm putting these visual elements where they are. And then I have concerts, and I have these concerts in any place that will let me have a concert. This was at the ICA in San Diego. We had a concert with a group called Project Blank, and I worked with composer Natalia Merlano Gomez, who wrote a piece for electronics and 2 voices, trumpet, and flute. And the way that we worked with this one is we wanted the audience in the middle of the space and have the audience be surrounded by the music. So it's a little bit hard to see, but the musicians are actually around the audience, and the audience is sitting in the middle. And then one thing I loved about this concert was that people closed their eyes at some point and really just listened to the music and really just listened to the audio interpretation of that data. So this kind of approach of merging storytelling and with data and with musical scores didn't just happen overnight. It had a very didactic beginning, as I mentioned. So I'm kind of going back in time now and showing you images of the time when I first started collecting weather data. And I went to the local hardware store and tried to find anything that could collect or could measure something. I found myself on Cape Cod, which is this peninsula in the southeast of Massachusetts, and we like to show it as a fist. Those of you who've been to Boston know what this is about. So this is southeast Massachusetts. Think of Boston as being up here. And then this fisted hand here is Provincetown. And Provincetown is surrounded by ocean. And of course, going there to measure weather also means measuring the ocean. And so for 18 months, I took my instruments and went to these specific beaches in Provincetown and measured things. And I also built my own data collecting devices. And I would also make observations about what was happening on the beach while I was out there collecting these numbers. You know, what kind of vegetation was washing up on shore, what kind of birds were migrating, what was the sound like, how did the humidity change the sound? I noticed that I could hear the whales much better when there was really low humidity and things like that. And then I'd go back to the studio, gather more data from other buoys, weather stations, historical data, and then get to work and start translating all of that data. And for those of you who have been to the workshops and to the classes, this is going to look familiar. But basically, I'm using the basket as a kind of clock. So think of the basket as having vertical elements and horizontal elements. And this basket here has 48 vertical elements. So I'm creating a 24-hour clock. And then I'm simply translating this data that you see here on the right. You have moon data and sun data. We're in the Antarctic, so the moon has a bit of a funky behavior. Sometimes it's above the horizon. Sometimes it's always below the horizon. But what's important here is the flat rate is when I start weaving when the moon is up in the sky, and I stop when it sets, and I do the same thing with the sun. So again, it's very simple. But what I've found over time is that when I take this approach and I translate, here I'm looking at the first day of sunlight in Antarctica to the first day of 24-hour sunlight in Antarctica, these strange warps started coming about. Here I'm translating 5 data sets: moon, twilight, 3 types of twilight, and then the sun data. And so these warps are really the numbers that are contorting and twisting the grid. And once I have this structure, I have a 3-dimensional calendar that I can plot more things on it, but I also have something that is sitting now in space, and somehow I need to figure out what to do with it. But here's a close-up. You can add more data on top of it. The high and low tide readings were added, the moon phases, the solar azimuth. And this is another one of my favorites. One of the students asked a really great question, and he asked, what are some of your favorite pieces and why? And this is by far one of my favorites because this took me over a year to make. So sometimes the more they wrestle with me, the more they are stubborn, the harder I have to work with them, the closer I feel to them. So this is a piece called Boston Tides, and it actually is sort of the size that you see here. So it's actually pretty close to real life. And the inner basket is sun and moon data over a month, and then over a year, And then I have daily high and low tide readings, moon phases, solar azimuth in the middle, and the solar noon. And one of the reasons I love this piece is that it taught me something very important, and that is the beauty of awkwardness. People didn't know how to respond to this piece because of the spaces in which I was showing this. So in a science museum, people read it as a tidal chart. So they kept trying to find the numbers and figuring out what's the high and low tide reading. And then in an art museum, it became this aesthetic object. So it was all about how do we pivot this? How does this look next to this piece of art, that piece of art? And the data really wasn't all that important. And then in the craft world, it started this conversation about the utilitarian quality of basketry. what is the function of this piece came up. So I loved how each of these spaces kind of brought out different questions, but it also revealed biases that people would bring to this work, saying, oh, well, I'm looking at, I'm not expecting to find basket making, basket weaving, or read in the context of data. So therefore, this must be an artistic expression as opposed to a chart. And so I was really interested in that, those kind of expectations that I was forcing on people to consider. So here's another one, warm winter, same clock, 24-hour, pretty much the size. I like the screen. It's actually showing you the size. This is translating warm temperatures from air, land, and sand temperature. I had a sand temperature. No, air, water, and sand temperature. There we go. Meaning I stuck the thermometer into the sand. And then you have data from Provincetown as well as historical data. And here's a close-up. So it gets really complicated very quickly. As you can see here, that 24-hour range is also given a temperature range, which is how I translate these data points. So all of this stuff was interesting, but it became predictable. And also people started liking it too much. And that was sort of my point of saying, okay, let's change something. This is not interesting anymore. And also, one of the things I look at weather instruments is that they're metronomes. They're really good at measuring things very precisely, every hour, every minute, and so forth. But humans are not metronomes. We respond to weather in a much more personal way. We have emotional responses to weather. It's with us from the day we are born to the day we die. It witnesses everything we do. When we have something like a hurricane and it devastates a community, the rebuilding is very complicated. It ensues a lot of varying responses. And so I started to get more interested in us as a species trying to come to terms with these extreme weather events. And this is sort of where the sculptures had to change, because one of the things they had to start being is they had to bring in some sort of conceptual lens through which the data could be read. So the very first pieces I kind of explored with this idea were pieces I did on Hurricane Sandy. So Hurricane Sandy caused a lot of devastation in the Northeast, and I focused on New Jersey and New York, particularly on communities that had amusement parks that were destroyed. And I was interested in how quickly these amusement parks were rebuilt and how, from an outside perspective, it was like, well, how can you rebuild this roller coaster right where it was? It's going to happen again. And I think this kind of perspective is a little bit narrow, because these amusement parks are extremely deeply connected to the economic fabric of communities and to the identity of communities. So the impulse to rebuild is not just to ignore what's happening to the weather and to our planet. It is also deeply ingrained in this idea that our sense of home is somehow solid, and it is. So I was interested in how these communities were wrestling with this, and so these amusement parks became a kind of metaphor for our complicated relationship with the coast. And so what you're seeing here is an amusement park made out of a roller coaster and a Ferris wheel. This is taking data from Hurricane Sandy from Seaside Heights, and it's translating the roller coaster like a graph. So you can literally see how high the wave height was, how high the wind was, just by following the line of this roller coaster. And the same thing with the Wonder Wheel up there. You can read the weather off of Hurricane Sandy. So those circles that you see are actually clocks. So you can, and then that tells you, and that kind of gives you to the blue dots are wind readings. So it tells you what the wind was at a particular time. But at the back is this Wheel of Fortune you can spin to find out how many houses are going to be underwater, depending on how high the sea surge is. So this sense of gambling starts coming into these structures. This is a piece that is sitting over there, being very polite under a glass box. And this is also from Hurricane Sandy. And this is taking a slightly different approach. Again, same kind of data set, Coney Island, Seaside Heights. So you see the Ferris wheel here. You see the swirlingness. This is actually the roller coaster, and it's sort of all pivoting on this diagonal axis, kind of trying to replicate a hurricane, but also a spinning toy. So these things can be read in a lot of different ways. But it's called Chutes and Ladders because it's trying to reference a game, a toy that many of us maybe had as a kid, where it's a roll of dice, and depending on, you advance on so many squares, and if you're lucky, you're on a ladder and you go up. And then if you're unlucky, you go and you slide down a chute. So this idea of, again, gambling with the future and trying to figure out where are we the gamblers? Are we being gambled with? It's sort of this kind of strange situation that I wanted to explore. And then, of course, the detail here, a lot of people ask me, is this for kids? And maybe if you looked at it over there, it looks like a toy, and it's very deliberate. I'm trying to draw you into these pieces without telling you it's based on data, because you become a kind of detective. And you're like, well, what is this boat about? And there's a timeline. And then there's this wind stuff. And does the wind direction change over time? So it becomes a kind of game that you have to figure out yourself. I also started to not think of these hurricanes as these distinct chapters. A lot of times hurricanes inform other hurricanes and how we respond to them. And of course, for many years, the two major hurricanes that really defined the national federal response was Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy. And so this is called sibling rivalry. It is basically a map of both storms. This line that is dissecting, this kind of bluish line, is the Mississippi River that ends up in the Delta. Everything above the Mississippi River is a map of New Orleans and where the flooding happened, what the weather conditions were. That's the coastline. That's the Louisiana coastline. These big umbrellas are showing you the strength of Katrina as it went up the coastline and hit the coast. And then these amusement parks down here take, again, data from Sandy. So this is Coney Island. This merry-go-round is Brooklyn. And I'm just trying to kind of thrust these two narratives together to make you think a little bit about how do these two storms define the way that we think about hurricane recovery, at least at the time. So it's very specific. You can find out what all of these components are. And I don't really, you have to kind of find the legend. A question that came up a lot with the students is, how do you let people know what all this colorful stuff is? And there's a legend embedded in all of these pieces that you have to find. Now I'm going to switch over to music and talk to you a little bit about music. And again, I put this slide in because of a question that a student asked me, which is, what are some of the more important pieces that helped you transition? And I think one of the more important pieces I made at the Bemis Center at the Bemis Center Artist Residency in Omaha. And that artist residency is in the middle of, you're in downtown Omaha. And I wanted to measure data in a city. So I had this weather station, I strapped it on my body, and I would just walk the city. And every day, and I would record what I got. And of course, cities build their own weather systems. They create heat bubbles because of the building material, because of wind tunnels, because of the lack of vegetation. So a city itself can also create its own weather patterns. And so when I was making my walks through the city and getting all these different readings, am I recording weather or am I recording the city? I wasn't quite clear. And of course, what I got was this cacophony of data points that didn't make a lot of sense, because you walk down one street, it's 25 miles an hour wind. You walk down the other street, there's nothing, and it's super hot. So there was this dissonance that was coming up. And I thought, how do you deal with this dissonance? Rather than saying, this is bad data, let me figure out a way to put a voice. And so I ended up building an orchestra in which I gave each of these different parts of the data I was collecting a different role. So the conductor, who is this guy here, he's looking at all the astronomical data and all the historical tornado data. The back wall became a map of Nebraska, which was conveniently sort of rectangular. And then these two, the alto and the soprano, are taking data from each from 1 month of the data that I collected and are trying to translate them into these woven forms. So in other words, not one sculptor is telling the story, they're all telling the story together. And this I think, made me much more aware of thinking about music as a tool to explore nuances in data. And I started to integrate musical notation. And I had this great conversation with Nicholas at our meeting. And one of the things we talked about was that sometimes it's really good when you don't know everything. And I call it naivete. Sometimes it's good to be a little naive about what you're doing because you make decisions that you wouldn't necessarily make otherwise. And going into musical notation was definitely a very naive thing to do because I don't play music, nor can I read music. So I'm building my own musical system. And so the way that I would do it is to take the data, make it into a musical score, and then work with composers who understand the intent of these scores and try to interpret them. And then I take these scores and I build a sculpture with them that can also function as a 3D score. So we're sort of working off the same base material. This is the first score I wrote about grief. Trying to figure out if you can use just basic numbers to explore a period of grief. So this is about my father-in-law who died. And it shows the week from the day that we found out about his death to his funeral. And it's using just weather data from my weather station. And the only thing that's subjective is the tempo. That's that black line that gets squeezed together, is really spaced apart, and these words that describe it. So, and then also, again, I'm using these staff lines not the way a musician would. So this line in the middle here is noon, this is 6 p.m., this is 24 hours, this is midnight, and then I'm simply plotting all these dots which refer to these different weather variables. And then out of this came the Weather Score project, which was one of the best things I've done because through these collaborations, which are all based on scores that are made out of weather data, I get to collaborate with musicians and composers all over the country. And it's they who tell me what works, what doesn't work. And it's an opportunity to see how somebody else wrestles with this idea of data as an artistic material. And where are the constraints, where are the inhibitions, and where's the freedom? Here is a score on Harvey Twitter SOS that I found. I found when I was working on Hurricane Harvey, I found this really interesting data visualization that showed Twitter messages that were sent out during the hurricane when the 911 system broke down. And this is an example of a score where I'm creating a map. So this gray outline here is actually the highway system of Houston. Then these red dots are where the Twitter messages were sent. These are some of the Twitter messages. This is the amount of rain that fell. And down here, there's a timeline. So it's a graph, but it's also a map. And then you have wind readings as well, which is what these dots right now here are. And then I made a piece like this called Harvey Twitter SOS, which took all of that information and made that inner quilt, which is all about Hurricane Harvey. But then surrounding that quilt is this other story of the recurring problem that Houston has with flooding. The more I worked with composers, the more the scores changed. So they became more almost like map-like. This is Hurricane Maria. This is a map of Puerto Rico. And then this turned into this, which is my version of that score. And then finally, this piece, which is going to lead us to the performance, this is a piece called Build Me a Platform High in the Trees So I May See the Waters. And of course, it's supposed to be ironic because you're high in the trees and the water's already there because the water's coming. This is a piece that is about flooding events that have taken place in Louisiana since Hurricane Katrina. So it's looking at a hurricane, it's looking at a river flooding, it's looking at a precipitation event that sort of never coalesces into a hurricane, but still manages to dump 10, 15 inches of rain. And it also looks at very slow sea level rise. So again, the map here, this woven band is the Mississippi River. This is the Delta. This is a rain event in Baton Rouge. I can't remember the dates now. I'll show you in the next slide. Translating precipitation data and wind data of that event. And then you have here, these columns are looking at sea level rise. Down in the Delta, they are sort of looking a little bit like, what do you call this in English? Oil rigs, because a lot of the problems with increased sea level rise down there has to do with the fact that the Delta has been altered physically quite a bit, and it really accentuates the sea level rise as well as the sinking of the land. And then you have Hurricane Katrina up there with the wheel. That's Hurricane Katrina. And the levees made up of dominoes that reference hurricanes that have been retired. So it's kind of a complicated piece. But it really starts with this. This is the score. And so you can sort of see it simplified. Each of these are the 4 different water events and how water entered these different communities through rain, river, sea level rise, and hurricanes or storm surge. This is the score that I gave to these musicians over there. And Patrick, Annie, Micah, and Emma are going to perform Streams. So this is a piece by Harrison Ponce, who interpreted this score right here. Harrison is a student from Denison University who majored in physics, in chemistry, and in composition. And this is an example of what a composer does with a score. Harrison grew up in Miami and took these different ways of water, movement of water, and used his own experience growing up in Miami and experiencing these kinds of flooding himself, and wrote this piece called Streams, which is now going to be performed by Patrick, Annie, Micah, and Emma.
So I'm Emma Condelier. I'm actually the Director of Marketing and Communications for the School of Data Science, and I'm also a cellist. And so when we learned that Nathalie's art also comes in musical format, I clearly jumped at the chance, and she has a variety of scores, and I'm like, I'm going to get the string quartet, and we're going to perform it. Let's go around and quickly introduce.
Hello, I'm Micah Hunter Chang, and I am a first-year PhD student in biomedical sciences, and I moonlight as a violist and violinist as well.
Hi, I'm Annie Kim. I'm a professor at the law school, and I also moonlight playing violin. I play with the Waynesboro Symphony. We're doing a fundraiser concert next Friday night. Emma and I are both in it, so plug for that.
Hi, my name is Patrick Keys. I'm the Alternative Transportation Coordinator here at UVA, so bike policy and infrastructure.
And Patrick and I played together in EBIS string quartet. So Streams was composed in 2019. It was an interpretation to accompany the piece of art, the wall structure installation that Nathalie just showed you. Build Me a Platform High in the Trees So I May See the Waters. The wall sculpture uses weather data, and this is Harrison's program notes for the piece you're about to hear. The wall sculpture uses weather data and accounts of the human experience to demonstrate the disasters caused by 4 separate flooding incidents as a result of hurricanes in New Orleans. And the music is an attempt to focus deeply on the emotional aspects of the human experience during flooding disasters. So since I work for the School of Data Science, I had to email and text Harrison, and I said, okay, I need to know more about the process specifically around the data. And he wrote back, I used Nathalie's data and her musical score drawing, as well as her sculpture, as entry points to analyzing the data himself. It was interesting to see how it was interpreted already in different mediums. My score was written with the various data sets and trends in mind, trying to have a few distinct sections throughout the piece. And you'll hear those actually in this 8-minute piece, but with elements that tie it together throughout and then come back again. So I hope you enjoy Streams.
What absolutely stunning. Thank you all so much. So we have some time for some questions. If you're brave enough to ask them in the audience, but Natalie will also be around as well as the musicians afterwards, so you can have an opportunity to have one-on-one. But we'd love to open up for discussion. I'll start walking and roaming.
Super interesting talk and great performance. Natalie, I was wondering, because you have so many musical elements that have kind of become interwoven into your pieces, even though you yourself, you said, don't have a super technical musical background, do you kind of listen to music as you work, or does it, is there an involvement during your creative process with music, or do you just kind of plot it and the numbers let it take form?
So that's a good question. If I had more time, I would have talked about this a little bit more, but there are composers who have been very influential in helping me envision complex systems interact in 3D. And I know this sounds maybe a little bit strange, but when I was in grad school, Steve Reich was a composer that when I listened to his work, it was like, this is what weather sounds like. This is what weather looks like in my head. So music, after Steve Reich has, not just his music, but other people's music became a kind of model through which to envision complex systems interacting with each other. So while I'm not necessarily listening to the music, the way that they wrote the music has influenced the way that I think about the data and how I might incorporate it. But in terms of actually building the score, when I'm building something like this, I try not to impose a kind of expectation of what it should sound like or what kind of instruments I want to use, because I want that to be the choice by the composer to make. And also a lot of, in terms of the instrumentation, is really sometimes circumstances such as what kind of instruments are available, what is the funding. So there has to be flexibility in terms of how this is going to be adapted. And I find that the less musical expectations I have for these pieces, the more surprises arise and the more I actually end up learning about the data. And I will also say the reason why I asked the musicians to stay up here on stage is because you all have had to work with this material yourself. And, knowing that this is based on data, sometimes that can change the way that you're actually approaching the notes. Now, in this case, you were already given a more traditional looking score, but this is part of the reason why I wanted you to kind of to be here on stage. And maybe one of you or several of you can address a little bit. Did it change knowing that this was based on data, or did you approach it as a musical piece? And that's it. Like, how did that sit with you, knowing that the basis of it, in a sense, were numbers?
Even though this is a contemporary piece, composers will often write next to their tempi the speed of the piece. They'll write a description. You have quarter note equals 58, but you also have inevitable, inescapable, and so you have to sort of interpret what that means, and that's a really interesting. It's been an interesting part of this process. And then hearing you speak about the storms and the inspiration behind some of your artwork has, even just in between like being in the green room and here, has helped me interpret it better. But would like to have spent more time with the numbers myself.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me because I think you were doing your own acts of base level translation and interpretation, and then Harrison wanted to imbue the piece itself with more emotion, and then he wrote some very detailed notes for the musicians, not just about tempi and the speed, but about mood. And so some composers do that, and sometimes he had notes, for instance, about this should be a little bit like raindrops, like water drops even. This should be lifeless. And I sort of imagine like a lifeless tree limb. And so we were interpreting and transposing on top of his, interpreting and transposing on top of yours. So it's kind of a tertiary, or I don't know what the word is, the fourth level interpretation. But ultimately, I think that as musicians, we tried to bring coherence and cohesion to the piece and to make it sound evocative.
I will say I'm sorry, should I not?
No, go ahead. I'm going to take it in different directions. Go ahead.
Okay, well, real fast, I will just say, as someone who spends a lot of time just in data day to day as like a bench scientist or a technician, or now as a PhD student, it's really an exciting opportunity to be able to actually create art out of something that is normally so like static and flat. So even like those very repetitive sections and musical motifs that you just sort of cycle through as, what's on the page, being able to actually create meaning out of that is a really cool opportunity. So thank you. It was really, really a fun, valuable and meaningful opportunity.
My question actually relates to, I think, Annie's response to that question. So a good segue. As a musician myself as well, actually, I'm very interested in how it impacts, see, she's got a lot to say about it too. How it impacts you, Nathalie, when you hear various interpretations of the musical score of the work that you've done. So I wonder if you ever go back to your pieces and think about
because every performance, especially every live performance, as we know, is different, and every set of musicians is going to add that level of interpretation. And does that have an impact on your artistic process or the way that you think about, do you revisit your pieces? Do you revisit the process the next time with a different lens?
Yes. So absolutely. It goes back and forth. So I've made pieces based on notes that the composer has made about the score. I'm really interested in seeing process notes. So sometimes if they're willing, they'll give me the notes. And so I've done pieces based on that. We have done pieces where the composer will start with a composition using just the data, and then, so not my score, but the raw data, and then me creating a piece based on that. And so it goes back and forth depending on, it sort of depends on what the composer wants to do with this, because I want these scores to be something that pushes them towards something they haven't done before. And so every composer chooses a different route, but yes, definitely it happens that way as well.
Thank you. This is very fascinating, and this is particularly inspiring for me as I am now working in the STEM field, but I create arts myself as a dance choreographer. I am curious, especially how much of person, especially when you're building the more visual works, how much modulation do you make that's following your own artistic instinct, or how much of it changes even though it's based on a set of data in your creative progress, and that's turning into what we see in the end, or how much of the progress is more of I'm giving myself, this is the set rule of the game I'm playing today, and this is almost a score that I am giving myself. So even if someone else takes the same game rule and goes through this building process, they will get something similar as a result.
Right. So one of the things that's important is that the numbers never get changed for aesthetic reasons. So the integrity of the number is key. And if the visual translation doesn't work visually, then I have to change the visual translation, not the numbers. The numbers are always the baseline. That's the key. But having said that, yes, of course, I make tons of aesthetic decisions. And I work with what I have. I work with material that I can mess up with. A lot of what you don't see is the 90% of the stuff that ends up in the dumpster. So, it takes a long time to get to these pieces. I mean, the scores are a lot of work. And so yes, there's a lot of aesthetic decisions that come into play, but the numbers are always going to be the numbers. So that's the important part. Yes, if you and I were starting up with the same base art material, data, and you and I would be working with the same base art material, you and I would create completely different pieces. So there's no formula here.
Time for one more question, and then we'll hang around for a little bit.
Thank you for this. This is beautiful. My question to you is, as far as, and you were talking about your aesthetics when you create your pieces, do you find yourself gravitating towards the same component for the same type of variable? For instance, like when you were talking about the magnitude of the storm and it looked like you used the umbrellas, do you find yourself using that for magnitude or being drawn to use the same component in all of your pieces?
Yeah, so this is what we were talking about. I try to, play is really important in the studio, but I find play to be very difficult. To really create the conditions of play, you have to allow yourself to be completely free and mess up and have no expectations whatsoever. So I find that the conditions of play are really hard to create in the studio because of habits. And so habits creep in really quickly. Oh, blue worked really well for wind. Gee, let me use it again. The umbrellas. Oh, I have 50 more umbrellas that I know what to do with. Let me use them again. So these things do creep in. And so this is why bringing it back to these artists in residencies, why these opportunities are so important, because they bring me out of the studio. They bring me into this very different and very clean environment compared to my studio, in which I engage with people who think about data in just as much of a creative way, but they use different tools. And so it helps me realize, first of all, I do use a lot of umbrellas. I didn't even notice that. So sometimes artist residencies are not just about creating new work, they are also about actually recognizing one's own habits, which can really get hidden very quickly when one gets comfortable with them. So, and so in many ways, artists in residencies are an effort to bring back play into the studio, but it requires sometimes getting away from the studio.
So let's please all join me one more time in thanking Nathalie and our 4 fantastic musicians for sharing their art with us tonight. If you haven't found it yet, we have 9 of Nathalie's pieces on exhibition within the building. Most are on the 2nd floor, but there's also the sculpture here on the 1st floor. And so please feel free to roam about the building. We have some refreshments over here, and Nathalie will be around to discuss some more of art and data and everything in between. So thank you all again for joining us tonight.